to the OSM channel. In today's video, I'd like to teach you how to replace the brake pads as well as adjust the brakes on a Craftsman ride-on lawnmower. My specific model is a Craftsman LT2000, but I believe many of these ride-on lawnmowers were manufactured by the same manufacturer, thus the process should be very similar, if not identical to other makes and models as well. So without further ado, let's get started. Now that brake assembly is right behind this right rear tire. We're going to have to remove that tire. So step number one is to jack up the rear of the lawn tractor and support the tractor with a jack stand as well. To remove the rear tire, we're going to have to first remove this dust cap. I'm going to remove it with this hook back pick. Get a purchase and pull out. Wipe some of the grease away so we can see what we're doing. Next, we need to remove this C-clip. This C-clip prevents the wheel from falling off the axle. To remove the C-clip, you can use a flathead screwdriver or a pick. Next, remove any other washers on the outside of the axle. And now we can remove the wheel, thus gaining access to the brake assembly. Just also note that there is a key on this axle shaft. My key stayed in place, but if it falls, just ensure you put it back when you go to reassemble the wheel back onto the axle. So first we're going to disassemble everything. We'll clean everything, install the new brake pads, and then I'll talk about adjustment. So this is the push rod coming off the brake pedal. So we are going to need to disconnect this caliper assembly from this push rod. In order to do so, we're going to remove this hairpin cotter. Then there's also a washer. Remove that washer. Next, we have to remove the two caliper retention bolts, 3/8 inch bolt here, 3/8 inch bolt here. Then we can slide the caliper assembly off the push rod. So after you unbolt the caliper assembly, you may notice that a few things drop. Well, the first thing that may drop is the brake pad itself. Then behind the brake pad is a steel plate which pushes evenly on the brake pad. And then finally, there are two pins in here and they push on the steel plate, which we are going to take this up to the workbench and clean it up and inspect it, but I just wanted to show you that. Now the next thing we need to remove is the brake disc. Hidden behind the lower portion of the brake disc is the second brake pad. Now you should be able to pull this off by working it back and forth a little bit. Mine's a little bit stuck and I have these small pullers. I never get to use them, and now is the perfect time to use them, so I'm going to use them. Well, that brake disc was actually pretty stuck on that shaft, so I'm really happy I had a little puller hanging around. So before you attempt the job, you may want to get yourself a little puller, but we now have access to the second brake pad. And taking a look at it, you can see there's a fair bit of wear. But if money's tight, what you can do, you can just flip these around and use the other surface if need be. But I got a new set of pads, so I'm going to replace them. So I'm having an issue with my caliper assembly. There's a lot of binding, which now is a good opportunity to talk about how this actually works. So when you push on the brake pedal, that push rod goes back, ties into this lever, and this lever pivots on this bolt. Now if you look where this lever pivots, this piece of steel is actually twisted. So as you push down on this lever, there's like an inclined plane. So as you push this down, it actually pushes in on these two pins. And for some reason, when I push down on this, these pins aren't popping up like they should. There's like a lot of binding, so I'm not sure if there's a lot of wear, but you can see that slant. And if I flip it around, same thing on the other side, that slant. So as you push down on this, that's how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to push in on those pins, and then you have this spring, which ultimately pulls the assembly back off the brakes to release the brakes, but I'm not sure what's going on here. I see that there's a lot of dirt collected in here, so I think we're going to take this apart and see if we can clean this up, get it working better. If not, I may have to replace the housing, but let's remove this bolt. And I'd also like to note this is a brake adjustment here as well. So this bolt, well, I don't need these pins. Now where this lever that pushes on our pins bolts onto the caliper, this is an adjustment point. So you can loosen or tighten this nut to control the space in between this ramp and the caliper housing itself. Just wanted to throw it out there. So let's remove this nut and dig into this thing a little bit further. 1/2 inch. So we have a nut, our bracket, a washer, and our lever, then also a spring on that stud. So I definitely see a buildup of brake dust and dirt in here, so let's try and clean up this caliper as much as possible. So I got the caliper all cleaned up. Now I reinstalled the slide pins, and when I wiggle the slide pins, look at how much play there is. So really, I don't think the brake pads were my issue. I think my issue really is that the caliper is worn and needs to be replaced. However, I don't have that part. I'm going to see if I can extend the life of this brake caliper by applying some silicone paste to these slide pins. So I'll do that, reassemble everything. But I'm going to reinstall this momentarily just to show you what that binding issue is kind of looking like on camera. So you see the pins are in their position. And then when you go to apply the brakes, see how those pins, you know, they kind of want to push forward. And that is causing my binding issue in particular. But again, we can reduce some of that friction with the silicone paste, but you know, this is also an exposed spot, so I don't think it's going to last too long. It may get me through the season. You know, you start applying lubricant and then it attracts dust, and sometimes it can become worse than what it was before, but silicone paste should get me by for at least a little while. Alright, I got those pins all lubed up. Let's temporarily reinstall this actuation bracket. See if we're getting that binding issue. So I mean, I can still see that the pins are, you know, pushing forward, but there is no longer that same binding issue. Much smoother. So maybe what I'll do throughout the season is just squirt some penetrating lubricant on these pins to keep them going. But this should get me through another season. Now let's start reassembly. So I already have those slide pins in. Our actuation lever. So notice that there's a half moon. I believe that is going to face up. So we'll put our lever on, followed by the washer, this bracket, and then finally this nut. And we may need to adjust this nut once we reinstall everything. We'll see. We'll get this tightened up for now. A little too tight. Much better. Let's clean this area up a little bit. We'll protect the shaft with this rag. If you got compressed air, now would be the time to use it. I got this little paintbrush. Just a bad time to install this new inner brake pad. I'm going to lubricate this shaft first. And of course, my PB blaster has plenty of product left, but it's out of air. I'll get a can of something else. Yep, a little bit of silicone paste is going to have to do. Reinstall the inner brake pad. And hopefully that stays in place, which it does not want to stay in place. I'm sure that's going to fall out as I'm installing the brake disc, but that's just something to be aware of. I'll put a paper towel down so that doesn't fall in the dust in case it falls. Let's try and install the brake disc. Actually went all right. Beautiful. Alright, now it's time to reinstall the caliper back onto the machine. So the first thing we're going to do is reinsert this push rod into the receiving hole in the lever. Looks like there was a washer stuck on there, which that's good, because I'm not going to forget that now, but we'll Install that like so. And there's the other washer and hairpin cotter. Pop that in. Good. So on the caliper itself, you should have your 2 push pins, your push plate, and a plate of steel, and finally your brake pad. Obviously you don't want to get any grease on there if you can avoid it. So we'll flip this back around while kind of holding pressure on that brake pad. Line up our holes and start these fasteners by hand if at all possible. Now the fastener towards the front of the machine, you got to remember there's that spring that gets hooked onto the large part of the bolt, and it also gets hooked onto the lever here. So this is just to back this off anytime you're off the brakes. Just returns the lever forward. So that is all looking good. I'm going to tighten up these bolts a little bit more. Alright. So this is where we're going to have to start playing around with the adjustments here, especially this nut. So if I try and push the lever back right now, I'm unable to do so. And that is because I have this nut on here too tight. So I'm going to back this nut off. And you notice as I back this nut off, it allows more and more movement on the lever itself. So I have maybe a ½ inch of movement right there. I'm going to switch back over to my impact, and I'm just going to tighten up these bolts one more time, because if this nut was too tight, it may have prevented the 2 caliper holding bolts from being able to be tightened up all the way. See, we got that one a little bit tighter. That one seems pretty good. That's good. So what are the specs on everything? How much movement should there be within this lever? Well, a moment ago I just showed you that you can adjust the amount of play on this lever by loosening this nut or tightening this nut. Right now I have about 3/8 of an inch of movement. I do not know what the movement spec is on this lever, how much movement there should be. However, I do know what the spec is for the brake adjustment. So basically, when you set the parking brake, there should be 1.5 inches of distance between this surface on the lever to the rearmost tip of this nut, this adjustment nut. So here's what I plan to do. I plan to back both these nuts off all the way on this threaded rod. I'm going to set the parking brake, and then I'm going to tighten up this nut until there is 1.5 inches of distance between this nut and this lever. I'm going to push the brake down and set the parking brake. Brake at the caliper should have 1.5 inches. Now you see that nut's got to come forward about 3/8 of an inch. So let's tighten up that nut. So now that distance is right at 1.5 inches. I'm just going to release the brakes and apply the brakes just to make sure everything feels okay. Releasing the brakes. Everything feels okay. Now I'm going to tighten up this jam nut, reassemble everything else, put the tire back on, take it for a test drive, and we should be in good shape. Let's reinstall the wheel, ensure that that key is still in the axle shaft. Be a good time to grease up the shaft too. I did mine not that long ago, and I don't want a bunch of grease in the yard. Reinstall the washers. I have 2. Reinstall the C-clip. And the dust cap. These are always a pain in the neck. That wasn't too bad. Lower this bad boy back down and give her a test drive.